You're listening to Data Science Leaders, the premier podcast for executives tackling the world's most important challenges using the power of machine learning. Let's dive in. Welcome. We're lucky to have with us today Reid Blackman. He is the founder, CEO of Virtue Consultants, and his latest book is Ethical Machines. Thank you much, Reid, for being here.
It's my pleasure.
Now, obviously, the topic of responsible AI and ethical AI is everywhere, and everyone is worried, both rightly and wrongly. I would love to get your sense on how important is this? How worried should we be? How on top of people's minds should this be?
So it depends upon the nature of the threat that you're talking about. So there are some people in the AI community, so-called doomers, who think the sky is falling. Myself, I'm not particularly concerned about the sky falling in that way. I'd want to hear from those people more detail about what's causing the sky to fall, at what rate is it falling, why is it falling, are there things we can do about it? So I haven't heard a lot of that detail. So those threats I don't take particularly seriously. That's not to say I'm not open to an argument for that I ought to take it seriously, but I haven't heard the argument yet. The other set of risks, and these are the ones that I am concerned about, and I think we all ought to be, are many, and they're coming from all sorts of places, both because of the way that machine learning works and because of the uses to which we put machine learning. So, the three big ones, if you're talking about task-specific AI or ML, I'll use those interchangeably. You talk about privacy violations, bias or discriminatory models, and black box models. So those are the three standard concerns. And then now that we've got generative AI, we've also got concerns around violations of IP. We have hallucinations, so-called hallucinations, where the output is just false information, even though it's confidently expressed. And then we have what I call the problem of shared responsibility, which exists already, but it's sort of exacerbated with things like LLMs because the foundational model builders are making certain kinds of decisions. The downstream developers are making certain kinds of decisions. When things go off the ethical guardrails, it's not exactly clear how to apportion responsibility.
No, absolutely. There's some folks who would say, but wait a minute, those kind of concerns are the exact same concerns that we would have about people and about human-based processes. What is it about artificial intelligence that makes it more of a risk, more of a threat versus all of the biases and lack of transparency and things that we suffer with human-based processes?
So there's a couple of things to say here. So for one, it's not the bad behavior of data scientists, like it is the bad behavior of people that leads to bad things. So you talk about other kinds of ethical concerns in, say, corporations. You might worry about things like sexual harassment and discrimination. Those are real concerns, and they're often because of the bad behavior of people that can more or less be straightforwardly regulated. We know what the policies are, right? Don't sexually harass people. It's not hard to figure out, right? But when it comes to machine learning, you get a tremendous amount of decisions throughout the AI lifecycle made by data scientists who have, something like accuracy as their goal or, something along those lines. And they're making decisions that they don't realize have ethical risks, ethical impacts. And so it's not their bad behavior that's the problem. In some cases, it's just their lack of knowledge or lack of reflection or the lack of a process, a method, tools by which they can assess those risks. And even when they do know those risks are present and they try to do the right thing, it's not easy. At least in part, one, because it's just generally not easy, but also because data scientists don't have all the training, all the skills, all the experience that one needs to have in order to make good decisions. So you need things like cross-functional teams to be able to weigh in on certain key decisions throughout the AI lifecycle. So here I'm talking about people from risk and compliance and perhaps an ethicist and a lawyer. Those people are crucial for giving a proper assessment of the risks of the decision that's being made in the course of developing, deploying, monitoring the model.
Absolutely. Is there an element of which this is also, there's a different degree of scale when it comes to the decisions which are being made by these models versus when it comes to a person? So if a person is biased and flawed in their thinking, there's only so many decisions that they're going to be making versus theoretically a model, we could scale those decisions almost infinitely. So it's not that there's necessarily an implicit greater risk, it's just that these technologies are so powerful, they can have so much of an impact that we might end up proliferating mistakes that we make in developing these models. Is that more of it?
I wouldn't say it's more. I think a lot of that is right. So one of the taglines for one of my articles is something like, AI scales everything, including risk, or something along those lines. And it does. It's not that the risk is not, you said something like, it's not riskier. It's not that the risk is greater, but risk is a function of, in part, the severity of the impact, which is in part a function of how many people are impacted. So the risk is greater precisely because AI scales and it has, the point of it is to have a massive impact. And so if the impact is negative, that has a massive negative impact.
So the good news is that, yes, AI can be massively impactful. The bad news is that it can be massively impactful.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
absolutely. You were mentioning about the data scientist, and this is almost never a case, or very, very rarely would be a case of a data scientist being an intentionally bad actor. Yes, there might, and for most organizations, you might have Cambridge Analytics and a couple of other ones who might be intentionally bad actors, but most organizations are not inherently malicious. But instead, this is one of people, process, and technology incentives, the lack of best practices when it comes to developing models in an ethical fashion. To do this right, though, you need to have some sort of responsibility and accountability around that these models should be behaving in this ethical fashion. And certainly a portion of that should be on the data scientist. But is it really fair to expect the data scientist to bear most of that? Or is this one where, and indeed, is this even really fair to bear an ethical AI council to do this? Or at the end of the day, does this actually end up being, the conventional leaders of the organization, and that you need business leadership really to be accountable for responsible AI usage?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, you said what I would like to say. That's right. It's both unfair. I've said this a number of times. It's both unfair and unwise to put it primarily, let alone solely, on the shoulders of data scientists. It's unfair because they don't have the training, the experience, the knowledge, et cetera, with regards to ethical risks and what effective ethical risk mitigation looks like to do the job effectively. They can't do it by themselves. That's not because they're not smart enough or that they're lacking in character. It's just that this is a multidisciplinary effort and they're a single discipline, so they need help. So that's why it's unfair. It's unwise because then you're putting the lives of people and the reputation of your brand on the shoulders of people who can't do that task properly. So it's a mistake to think, as I like to say, we can math our way out of this problem. You can't you can't code your way out of these ethical impacts, these ethical risks. They require certain kinds of qualitative assessments and qualitative solutions. So no, don't just put it on the data scientists. It is on the shoulders of leaders to make sure that they build, they implement, they scale, they maintain an AI ethical risk program. And if something goes off the guardrails, my first instinct is not to blame the data scientists. It's frankly to blame the organization that failed to give the data scientists the conditions under which they could do their best with regards to those risks, and the conditions under which other employees, other people on staff, ethicists, legal lawyers, people from risk compliance, et cetera, which they can do, which they get their hands dirty in the design, development, deployment, monitoring of the model.
Agreed. I guess I'm wondering, when it comes to others in the organization, there certainly is a big push on the regulatory side and from others to go in and say we need to designate somebody who is responsible or is accountable for going in and certifying that these models are acting in a proper fashion. Is there anybody in an organization who could do that, or is this inherently one where it's going to have to be a multi-party, multi-role effort?
So both. You need multi-party, multi-role efforts in identifying and mitigating the ethical, reputational, regulatory, legal risks of a model. But that's not to say that there's not someone who should own the program as a whole. So there's got to be someone, hopefully in the C-suite, who owns the ethical risk program. And that means things like, old school, tracking the implementation, using metrics and KPIs to track the rollout of the program or the implementation of it, the compliance with the program, and the impact of the program. So you need to have metrics and KPIs built around those things. And then someone very senior needs to own that program. And they have to have buy-in from the senior most people in the organization, from the CEO, from the board. If they don't get that, then they don't have the authority to do what needs to be done. And I'll say one last thing on this front. You and I are talking about AI or ML ethical risks. But data scientists are going to be responsible, if they're not already, for a host of other technologies, right? So we're also talking about augmented and virtual reality, applications of blockchain outside of crypto, quantum computers coming down the pike in a couple of years, which is going to pour gasoline on the fire of black box models. So one thing that happens many times is that the people that I work with, let's say they're a chief analytics officer, a chief data officer, they have within their purview, we need to create an AI ethical risk program. One thing that I like to start with is, do you want a digital ethical risk program or an AI ethical risk program? Where AI ethical risk program is a subset of your larger digital ethical risk program. Sometimes they say, yes, let's do the bigger thing because we want to be proactive, we want to be comprehensive, we want to be systematic. I think that's the right thing to do. But in some cases, the leaders that I talk to have other leaders who won't support them on that bigger, more proactive development of a program. And so they stick, it's still way better than nothing. So they're to be applauded for creating the AI ethical risk program. But in my estimation, you want a digital ethical risk program of which AI plays, perhaps for now, an outsized part. But for that, you need buy-in from the very top of the organization.
And there's always that wonder of how is AI different from other technologies? And so there are plenty of other very, very impactful technologies that are important in the same way that AI is. But is there something which is unique about AI that makes it harder to use in a responsible or ethical fashion? Is there something about the rapidly changing nature of the patterns that you're trying to predict in data that mean that you need to construct this part of your program differently than how you would set up that broader program that also is applying to traditional technologies as well as very future-looking ones?
Okay, so there's a couple of things to say here. The first thing to say is you talked about using AI. It's about using the AI. And one thing that's worth highlighting is that the users are usually not the data scientists, right? So you have data scientists making a lot of decisions with regards to how to develop and design and build that AI. Some of those, then it gets given to the end user. And then the end user is now wielding a tool where the ethical impacts of that tool are disconnected or can be disconnected from the intentions of the user. So you give me a screwdriver, I could use it for good, I could use it for bad, right? I could build homes for the poor, I could build concentration camps. So the sort of, if you like, the ethical evaluation of my use of the screwdriver is derived from my intentions for how I want to use it. But you can use a highly discriminatory model in a hiring decision process, but you're just an HR manager. You don't know anything about data scientists. You don't know anything about bias or discriminatory models or what, parity is or something along those lines in the hiring process. So you're going to use a tool, and despite your intentions, despite your intentions, you will discriminate against people because you're using a discriminatory model. And that's because of what the data scientist did. So that's one way in which it's unlike, say, a standard tool like a screwdriver. There are ethical decisions or decisions that have ethical impacts built into the tools themselves, which is unlike, let's say, a tool like a screwdriver. Okay, that's one thing to say. The second thing to say is, I said this earlier, there's a certain subset of risks that are likely by virtue of how AI works. But let's talk about, ML in particular, it's a pattern recognizer, a really, really complex pattern recognizer. And so that's how we get the black box problem, right? You don't have the black box problem standardly with other things, but we get, or at least it's not as likely we could have it. We could have a decision tree in principle that's too complicated for any human to follow that decision tree, and so it's effectively a black box. But that's relatively unlikely. It's much more likely because as you add layers to your neural net, you're getting more and more complexity. You're getting more data points and more mathematical relations among those data points until you get to the point at which mere mortals can't understand what's going on between the inputs and the outputs. And that's because of how ML works. You get potentially discriminatory patterns because it recognizes patterns in data. If those patterns contain in some way or other or reflect certain kinds of discriminatory patterns in society, then it'll recreate and scale those. That's just what it does. The fuel of machine learning is data. Often that's data about people. So organizations who want to create accurate ML, all else equal, are highly incentivized to gather up as much data as they can, often about people. And so it's the nature of ML to incentivize data scientists, data engineers, whomever, to collect data that the possession of which, let alone the use of which, may itself constitute a violation of privacy. So it's because of how machine learning works that we get those big three ethical risks as not being, just possible, but quite likely given how ML works. Notice you don't get that stuff with blockchain, for instance. I know this is not a blockchain conference, but we're not worried about the black box problem with blockchain because it's not the nature of blockchain technology to recognize really complex patterns and vast troves of data. It is for machine learning, and that's why we get the black box problem. It's not of the nature of blockchain. Blockchain's not fueled by the more data you have, the better, all else equal. So you don't get the same kind of concerns or source for privacy violation with blockchain. So that's what I find generally interesting, both from an intellectual and a pragmatic perspective about what you might call digital ethics or digital ethical risks. It's that what sets it apart is not some principal distinction that we're doing a different kind of ethics over here when it comes to digital technology. We're not. It's a sort of, if you like, the same old ethics. What's different from a pragmatic perspective is that there's a certain subset of risks that are quite likely, given the nature of the beast That is the technology.
But when we are talking about these as being black box models, I mean, arguably the ultimate black box models are us human beings ourselves, in the sense of when it comes to us being able to explain our actions, we can explain them, but almost invariably they have almost nothing to do with the actual reasons that we made those decisions. So isn't there an element here whereby when it comes to these models, yes, they are encoding potentially biases or biases that are inherent in the data, et cetera, but to a certain extent, they're a lot more transparent and they're certainly a lot more testable than we are as human beings. So I guess I'm curious, is there an element whereby, well, one of the reasons why it's different is because these are decisions or capabilities that are much closer to what we do as humans. But two, there's this element of there's an opportunity here to go in and actually make better, more improved decisions because we can actually see and monitor and test and potentially mitigate the biases that are in a machine learning model versus in a human being.
Yeah, this is a great question. Okay, so there's a couple things to say. One thing to say is that I'm not totally convinced that humans are as black box as cognitive scientists wants to say. I mean, it's a very sort of sexy proposition. Oh, we have no idea what's going on inside. We don't even understand our own actions. I'm sure there are cases in which that is the case. But there are other cases where it's not. I know why I chose the Chinese restaurant instead of the Italian restaurant, right? It's not, I don't know. I just found myself at the Chinese restaurant and I have no idea why. I mean, I can articulate reasons. The food's really good there. It's closer than the Italian restaurant. It's also cheaper. I had Italian last night, right? Those can all be reasons that I don't think, oh, Reid, you don't really know why you...
But what? Why you like Chinese food over Italian food, for example, would be one of those things as to something where we can come up with reasons for why we do or don't. Yeah. But often when the cognitive scientists look into them, they find our expected reasons for it are different from our actual.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get into deep philosophy here, which is fine with me. I was a philosophy professor for 10 years, so this stuff, I could talk about this all day. I mean, I think that there are reasons why I like Chinese food. I might say something about the combination of spiciness with sweetness or the lightness of the, certain kind of spice or the sensation that peppercorn causes. I could point out things. Now you might say, why do you like that? Why do you like that? And it might be the case that at some point I say, look, for the reason that it gives me this sort of nice sensation. And then now we might have to back up now to certain kinds of biological explanations for why I like this sensation and not that one. But, I wouldn't say that means I'm a black box. I think we can articulate to a fairly deep level why I prefer the Chinese food tonight over the Italian food. So that's one thing to say. Okay, but your point is well taken. There are also cases in which we know that people engage in post facto explanations, right? They do something, you ask what, kids are great at this, right? Why did you hit your sister? She hit me first. It's like, no, I was watching the whole time. No, she didn't. So we do give post hoc explanations. They are not the true explanations for why we did what we did. Incidentally, this is what LLMs do. We can talk about that if you want. It's actually worse than post hoc explanations for LLMs. They give what appear to be explanations that would, if they were explanations, are post hoc, but this just in, they're not even explanations. So put that to the side for a moment. I think the black box problem is a really interesting one. There are, I think, pretty decent reasons, and I actually articulate these reasons in my book, for thinking that explainability is important in a variety of cases, ethically important in a variety of cases. The unofficial view is it might not matter that much for the reasons that you sort of gestured towards, if not just articulated, which is that we want to know what the benchmark is. Can we do better than people? If what we care about is something like how many people are negatively impacted, by the decision from a perspective of racial justice or discrimination, we can see, well, humans, incarcerate, say, black people at this rate. The model incarcerates black people at this other rate. It's a lower rate. Crime would stay the same between those two options. Let's go with the black box model. That's not, I don't think, unreasonable. You need sufficient testing, right? You need to figure out what's the appropriate benchmark for deployment of the black box model. What's the benchmark for sufficiently safe or sufficiently tested or sufficiently trustworthy in these kinds of cases? And I agree, in some cases, it's going to be a black box. But if I can have a black box cancer diagnosing model that's 99% accurate versus the best doctor who's 75% accurate, give me the black box model.
Well, it sounds like maybe explainability isn't actually what we should be striving towards. What we really want is effectively trust. And when we unpack that, it's more something like, well, we want accuracy, we want reliability, we would like fairness, we would like all of these other aspects of this. And explainability is what we have and what we can talk about, and we've got methods against it, and so therefore we're focused on it. But actually, we should probably be focusing on that broader issue of something like trust or reliability, and I guess hence the term responsible.
I think, yeah. So I'll talk about this, in my talk. I actually don't find reference to the word trust that useful. One, I'd prefer trustworthy over trust. Con men can get you to trust them, even though they're not trustworthy people. So the question is, what constitutes being trustworthy? And in many cases, part of the answer is going to be that it's on the ethical up and up. And so we're just going to get thrown back usefully, I think, to the language of what's ethically required. Let me give you one example of why explainability might be ethically essential, not just as a means to the end or something like that of being trustworthy. But one kind of explainability is global explainability, right? So you've got global explanations and local explanations. Global explanations explain, if you like, the rules of the model. What are the rules by which inputs get transformed to outputs? Local explainability. Why did this particular input lead to this particular output? Why did this particular person get denied a mortgage? Versus global, what are the rules by which we grant or deny mortgages? You might think that one reason why global explainability is really important is that it's specifying the rules of the game. And if you don't know the rules of the game, then you can't assess whether the rules of the game are fair, just, reasonable, good, etc. So in some cases where the rules of the game are crucial, you might think we need global explainability. I'll give you one example. Criminal justice system. One thing that we think is really important is what we call procedural justice. We don't, if you like, have the ground truth about whether the person is innocent or guilty. What we have are procedures, and we think that those procedures are just because they're fair procedures, because they standardly, or we think, they conduce to getting us the right answer. And if the procedure is, if there's an aberration in how the procedure was carried out, we think it's an unjust procedure.
But potentially there are other objective functions. We might be trying to solve for something like group fairness, or we might be trying to solve for something at individual fairness. And it sounds like all three of those different, with procedural fairness, group fairness, or individual fairness, could in theory, and sometimes do, conflict with each other.
Sorry, I think that those don't, as it were, they're not on the same level. Procedural fairness is the process by which we determine the output. And maybe what we're aiming for in the output is group fairness, but that's not the same thing as the procedures by which we arrive at that stuff. The question is whether we think having a certain just procedure, a procedure that we know to be just or fair, is necessary, let's say ethically necessary, for example. In that case, you need global explainability, because otherwise you have a crucial part of the procedure that's opaque. And if that crucial part of the procedure is opaque, we can't know whether that bit of the procedure is just or unjust, fair or unfair, good or bad, reasonable or unreasonable, et cetera.
So is it fair to say that you need explainability on many different levels? And so hoping that a single explainability metric might solve your problem is probably short-sighted, and you need it at the level of an individual explanation, at the level of the overall model, and potentially even at the level of the system, at the level maybe even of a particular KPI or outcome that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so look, I'm not going to tell you, in all cases, you need explainability. I'm not going to tell you that in no cases do you need explainability. It's going to vary by use case. So the question is, for a leader who's developing an appropriate AI ethical, reputational, regulatory risk program, is what's the process by which we assess on a, let's say, per model basis, who needs what explanations? Because it's not just the data scientist who needs explanations, it might be the end user, right? If you're a fraud detection agent and the ML, the software has flagged some transaction as potentially fraudulent, and you're a fraud detection agent, and you're looking at it and you're saying, why did it flag it? You're going to need some kind of explanation for why this thing was flagged. And it's going to be an explanation that is not the kinds of explanations that data scientists avail themselves of. It's not going to be the Lime and Shap variety, right? So we use tools like Lime and Shap if you're a data scientist to peer inside the black box. That's not the kind of thing that you give to a fraud detection agent or a doctor or a nurse using a tool in healthcare. It's not an explanation that you give to someone who's just denied a mortgage. Oh, why were you denied? Well, read this report that only data scientists can understand. That's not an explanation.
The explanation needs to be context specific. It needs to be relevant. It needs to be tailored in a fashion that somebody could actually use and make an informed decision.
Yeah, those are all good criteria for what constitutes a good explanation. Mm-hmm. It's intelligible to the intended audience. It speaks to what their needs are. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Reid, thank you very, very much for your time. Again, I would highly recommend that individuals out there go and read Reid's book on ethical machines. Thank you very, very much.
It was my pleasure.
And also see Reid's talk at Rev4. Thank you very much. You've been listening to Data Science Leaders from Domino Data Lab. If you found our discussion insightful, be sure to subscribe to never miss an episode. Your support helps us deliver cutting-edge content and keep the data science community informed and inspired. We appreciate every review. Until next time.